The encounter. The late afternoon sun slanted across the glass windows of La Maison d'Or, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Scottsdale, Arizona. The place was a temple of refinement, designed to make even the wealthiest patrons feel that their money was well spent. Polished marble floors reflected soft amber light from crystal chandeliers overhead, and every table gleamed with white linen, polished silver, and crystal stemware. The faint strains of piano music filled the air, so delicate it could almost vanish if one stopped listening. The atmosphere whispered luxury, but beneath it all lay the quiet hum of effort. Servers weaving through the tables with trays balanced effortlessly. Voices kept low but steady, the kind of disciplined choreography that only years of practice could build. Among the staff, Danielle Rhodes had earned a reputation that stretched beyond her assigned tables. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a presence. Her tall frame carried itself with dignity, her steps measured, her eyes sharp, and her smile, while professional, held just enough warmth to make regulars ask for her section again and again. She had been working here for 2 years, yet she already seemed part of the very fabric of the restaurant. She remembered guests' names, asked after their families, and could balance 3 wine bottles on one arm with the same composure she showed while soothing a nervous customer. Most who walked in never thought twice about the staff, but Danielle was different. She didn't let the job erase her humanity. This afternoon, though, felt heavier than usual. It was a Thursday, always busy with businessmen closing deals before the weekend, families celebrating milestones, and wealthy tourists seeking another story to brag about. Danielle had already been on her feet for 6 hours, yet not a strand of her dark hair was out of place. She moved with practiced calm, checking her notepad and gliding toward the new arrival seated at a window table reserved days in advance. The man sitting there was impossible to miss. Even in a restaurant designed for wealth, he stood out. His suit was cut so precisely it seemed sculpted, a dark navy tailored to frame his broad shoulders and slim waist. On his wrist gleamed a gold watch so heavy it caught every shard of light, almost daring people to notice. He sat reclined, one leg crossed over the other, phone in hand, as though the world around him was little more than background scenery. This was Farid al-Mansouri, a billionaire businessman visiting from Dubai. His reputation had preceded him. People whispered of the deals he closed, the luxury properties he owned, the arrogance he carried like a second skin. Even in a restaurant filled with powerful men, he radiated the kind of entitlement that dared anyone to challenge him. Danielle approached his table with the same polite professionalism she gave every guest. Her notepad rested lightly in her hand, her voice even and cordial. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to La Maison d'Or. May I start you off with something to drink?" Her eyes met his, calm, unflinching, though inside she already sensed the shift in the air, the invisible ripple that certain customers always brought. Farid didn't look up immediately. His attention stayed glued to the glowing screen in his hand, thumb scrolling lazily. The seconds stretched, and Danielle, who had mastered the art of patience, waited without moving. At last he glanced up briefly, as though noticing her existence was a mild inconvenience. His voice was clipped, his accent strong, his words delivered like orders. "Water with lemon. Nothing else." No smile, no acknowledgement of her courtesy. Just words stripped of kindness, spoken as if she were an appliance waiting to be programmed. Danielle nodded, unbothered on the surface. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right out." Her tone never faltered, but her eyes caught the smallest flicker of his expression, a curl at the corner of his mouth, the faintest smirk. She turned smoothly toward the bar, already used to dismissive customers. But what she didn't miss was the way he leaned slightly toward the young man seated across from him, an associate perhaps, younger, nervous, still eager to impress. In low, quick Arabic, Farid muttered a comment under his breath. The tone alone betrayed the meaning. Danielle's ears sharpened. She had grown up around Arabic for years. Its rhythm was not foreign to her. She didn't catch every syllable, but she knew enough. The insult wasn't harmless, wasn't innocent small talk. It was directed at her. She could tell by the way his eyes lingered on her retreating figure, the derisive curl in his lips, the small laugh that followed from his associate, awkward, half-hearted, but complicit. She carried the glass of water back with calm hands. The condensation dripped cool against her fingers as she set it gently in front of him. "Your water with lemon, sir." Her smile was faint but steady. She turned to leave, but another burst of Arabic followed, sharper this time, tossed casually toward his companion like a dart. His tone carried arrogance, superiority, as though mocking her in front of an invisible audience. Danielle didn't flinch. She placed the pitcher on her tray, straightened, and moved back toward the kitchen, but the words clung to her ears. She had endured customers like this before, people who believed that money excused cruelty, but this was different. This wasn't just arrogance. This was the kind of insult thrown under the assumption that it was safe, that no one could possibly understand. It wasn't about service, it was about dignity. She pressed her lips together and breathed slowly. She had promised herself years ago she would never let anger rule her in this job. But even calm had its limits. From across the floor, Brandon, another server, caught her expression as she passed. "Everything all right over there?" he asked softly, stacking empty glasses onto a tray. Danielle gave a faint shrug. "Same as usual. Some people don't see us. They just see the tray in our hands." But her eyes shifted briefly toward the billionaire's table, catching him watching her, not with admiration, not even with curiosity, but with the cold detachment of someone evaluating an object. And then once again he leaned toward his associate, muttering in Arabic. This time Danielle understood every word. He spoke of her appearance, her posture, her very presence, dismissing her as though she were beneath him. The insult landed sharp and deliberate. Her jaw tightened, though outwardly her movement stayed steady. She returned to the table to offer the specials. "Would you like to hear today's chef recommendations?" she asked, her voice still professional, though inside a fire burned. Fair didn't bother to meet her eyes for long. "I said water. Do you need me to repeat myself?" His accent was thick, his words clipped, the dismissive tone unmistakable. Danielle turned smoothly, letting the moment slide past her as though nothing had been said. But inside she knew something was shifting. A storm was gathering and she could feel the weight of it pressing closer. The associate, trying to lighten the tension, cleared his throat when Danielle asked for his order. I'll have the salmon, please. With vegetables on the side. Thank you." His tone was polite, grateful even, as though thankful to be acknowledged like a human being. Danielle rewarded him with a genuine smile before retreating to the kitchen. As she disappeared, Faird chuckled again, muttering another Arabic insult. Sharper, louder this time, so confident in his assumption that no one could possibly understand. But Danielle understood. She had understood from the beginning. And as she leaned against the counter in the kitchen, the order slip in hand, her mind wasn't on the salmon or the lamb he had demanded cooked to impossible perfection. Her thoughts were on her grandmother, on the afternoons in Casablanca when Arabic flowed like water through the streets, when her small hands turned the pages of old books and her grandmother's voice wove lessons of dignity, patience, and resilience. He didn't know any of that. He saw only a uniform, a waitress, someone beneath his notice. But he was about to learn otherwise. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation, but tension was beginning to coil. Invisible threads wrapping tighter with every muttered insult. Diners nearby could sense the arrogance in Farid's tone, even if they didn't understand his words. Danielle moved steadily through her motions, but inside she was waiting. Waiting for the moment when patience would no longer be enough, when silence would give way to something far more powerful. And as she set the bread basket on his table a few minutes later, her hands steady, her smile unchanged, Faird leaned forward, lips curling, and muttered the one remark that crossed a line too far. Danielle froze, only for a heartbeat, her breath stilling, her eyes narrowing just enough. She had heard enough. The storm was no longer far away. It was here, and this time she would answer, the reveal. The hum of the restaurant carried on, but at Farid's table a quiet theater of arrogance continued to unfold. He lounged back in his chair, the picture of wealth and entitlement, his phone once again glowing in his palm as though even in the middle of a meal he was far too important to look up. His associate sat stiffly across from him, shoulders drawn in tight, his face betraying unease, yet unwilling to challenge the man who signed his checks. Danielle approached again, balancing a tray with the bread basket, a small courtesy offered to every guest, her expression calm and practiced. She placed it delicately on the table, the soft aroma of freshly baked rolls rising between them. "Here's some bread while you wait for your meals," she said, her voice carrying the same polite tone she had used since the start. But as she pulled back, she caught it, the low growl of Arabic, sharper now, tossed out with calculated contempt. "Cheap. just like the one serving it. The words cut through her composure like a blade. Danielle's hand lingered on the edge of the table for a brief second, steady but tight. She had endured many slights before in her years of service. Dismissive tones, snapped fingers, careless insults. But this was different. This wasn't ignorance, wasn't a passing rudeness. This was deliberate. He wasn't just speaking to his associate. He was speaking through her, confident in his assumption that his words were shielded by language. Her jaw clenched, though her face betrayed nothing. She straightened, nodded once, and turned to step away. But the insult echoed not just in her ears, but in her memory, her grandmother's voice reminding her in Casablanca's crowded markets. Language carries respect, and respect carries the weight of your worth. Do not let others decide what you are worth. The younger associate shifted uncomfortably, his fork tracing patterns on the linen, clearly aware of what had been said. He opened his mouth as though to intervene, but quickly shut it. His silence was heavy, his complicity born of fear rather than cruelty. Danielle continued her rounds, refilling water glasses, taking orders, all while the storm gathered silently within her. She wasn't angry in the reckless way that burned fast and left destruction in its wake. No, this was a deeper, slower fire, one that grew with each mocking glance, each dismissive word. It wasn't only about her. It was about every waitress treated as invisible, every worker stripped of dignity by the arrogant belief that money excused cruelty. When she returned again with the water pitcher to refill Farid's glass, the room seemed to hush ever so slightly, as though the walls themselves anticipated something. Farid leaned back, one hand tugging at his tie, his lips curling once more. Then he said it, this time louder, this time without even lowering his voice. She should be grateful we even let her work here. A woman like that belongs in the kitchen, not standing in front of me. The Arabic rolled off his tongue with a cruel edge, laced with contempt. The words were more than insult. They were degradation. They stripped her not just of courtesy, but of humanity. The associate dropped his gaze immediately, ashamed. A man at a nearby table glanced up, frowning, though he couldn't understand the words. The tone was enough. Something in the air shifted. The piano music, once soft and calming, seemed suddenly too faint, unable to mask the tension that rippled outward from that table. Danielle's fingers tightened around the glass as she finished pouring, her movements precise, deliberate. She set it down gently without a sound, her eyes never leaving his. The billionaire smirked, convinced of his untouchable superiority, his arrogance radiating from every inch of his posture. And then, with the weight of years behind her, Danielle inhaled deeply, and in Arabic as fluid and flawless as his own she spoke. Her voice was low, calm, yet it cut through the air with the sharpness of glass. "Would you like more bread, sir, or are the insults filling enough for you?" The silence was instant, absolute. The glass between them might as well have been a chasm. Farid's smirk faltered, his eyes widening in disbelief, the phone slipping slightly in his grip. His head snapped up, stunned, his entire composure cracking like porcelain under pressure. His associate's jaw dropped, his eyes darting between the two of them, shock written across his face as though the entire ground beneath them had shifted. For a moment, Farid tried to recover, forcing out a brittle laugh. "Oh, so you picked up a few words from a phrase book? Cute?" His attempt at mockery was thin, shaky, a man scrambling to regain control. But Danielle's gaze did not waver. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes unblinking, and responded in the same language, her voice strong, steady, carrying the weight of truth. "No, I picked it up from my grandmother who raised me in Casablanca. Every word you've spoken since I came to this table I understood." The younger associate sank back in his chair, one hand over his mouth, half to hide his shock, half to shield his embarrassment. At nearby tables, diners paused mid-bite, forks hovering, eyes shifting toward the exchange. They didn't understand the Arabic, but they didn't need to. They could feel the electricity in the air, the sudden collapse of one man's arrogance under the revelation of another's hidden strength. Farid blinked rapidly, his lips parting, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in years he was at a loss. His tongue, so quick to deliver insults, faltered under the weight of her fluency. Danielle's voice carried again, quieter now, yet heavy with authority. "You assumed I was beneath you, that my uniform meant I was invisible, but respect is not optional. Not here, not anywhere." Gasps rippled softly through the restaurant. Even those who didn't understand the language felt the blowland. The power dynamic had shifted so sharply it left the air trembling. Farid sat rigid, his hand gripping the edge of the table, his gold watch glinting under the chandelier. But for once, it looked less like a badge of power and more like a chain holding him in place. He glanced around, realizing the attention now focused on him, the weight of dozens of eyes stripping him of the control he had always taken for granted. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint clink of silverware in the distance. Farid tried again, this time softer. His voice no longer a whip but a plea wrapped in denial. "You misunderstood me." He spoke in English now, desperate to reclaim ground, to pull the conversation into a tongue where he thought he might still wield dominance. Danielle raised an eyebrow, her face composed, her voice clear enough for every ear in the restaurant to hear. "No, I didn't." The words fell heavy, final, like a gavel striking wood. The couple at the next table exchanged a look, eyes wide with awe. A group of businessmen in the corner paused their conversation, leaning slightly closer. The waitstaff by the bar froze mid-step, watching. The billionaire who had once seemed untouchable now sat cornered, exposed not by shouting, not by aggression, but by calm truth spoken in a language he never imagined she possessed. And in that moment, the room belonged to Danielle. The backstory before the restaurant fell silent. Before a single word of Arabic rolled off Danielle's tongue, there was another story, one carved long before she tied her apron and walked the marble floors of La Maison d'Or. It began thousands of miles away, across the Atlantic, in a city alive with color and sound, where the call to prayer floated above narrow streets and the air was always perfumed with spices and dust. Casablanca. That was where Danielle had learned not only to survive but to stand tall, even when the world bent against her. Her parents' divorce had sent her life into fracture when she was only 8. One day she was a girl in Georgia with 2 parents under the same roof. The next she was boarding a plane with her mother, bound for Morocco to live with a grandmother she had only met twice before. Her mother needed time to rebuild, she had explained, and Danielle needed stability. What could be more stable than her grandmother's house with its stone courtyard and endless stream of cousins who seemed to fill the air with laughter? Danielle hadn't known then that those years would define her, that the language her grandmother spoke would become a shield, a sword, and a secret gift she carried like a jewel. Life in Casablanca was not easy for a child who felt caught between 2 worlds. At school she was the American girl, her accent making her stand out no matter how quickly she learned the words. In the neighborhood she was the granddaughter of a woman people respected deeply, and that earned her protection she hadn't understood at first. Her grandmother, Layla, was a woman of steel wrapped in gentleness. She ran her household like a quiet empire. Mornings spent baking bread, afternoons sewing for neighbors, evenings telling stories in the courtyard as lanterns flickered against the walls. Layla spoke Arabic not like a language but like music, every word deliberate, layered with wisdom. She had insisted Danielle learn, not from textbooks, but from living, listening to shopkeepers bargain in the market, women whisper secrets at fountains, children sing songs in the alleys. At first, Danielle resisted. She felt foreign, heavy with the loneliness of being uprooted, but Layla would not let her sink. She would cup Danielle's chin, tilt her face upward and say, "Respect is your inheritance, child. It is how you walk into a room, how you speak, how you hold your silence. Do not let anyone take it from you, not with money, not with words." And slowly, day by day, Danielle absorbed not only the language but the spirit of resilience her grandmother embodied. The years passed and Arabic seeped into her bones until she no longer thought of it as something learned, but something lived. She could argue with vendors in the souk, recite her school lessons without faltering, and sit cross-legged with her cousins listening to old folk tales where honor mattered more than gold. She discovered that the rhythm of the language carried power, not loud, not violent, but steady, commanding. By the time she returned to the United States at 15, her accent was fluid, her comprehension flawless. Yet strangely, she tucked it away like a secret. In America, people did not ask about Arabic. They did not see it as strength. At times they saw it as strange, even threatening. Danielle learned when to reveal it and when to guard it. Her teenage years in Atlanta were marked by adjustment and quiet battles. Her mother was working 2 jobs, rebuilding their lives, and Danielle carried more responsibility than most of her classmates. She studied hard, worked part-time, and learned that the world often assumed things about her before she opened her mouth. People underestimated her. Because she was young, because she was black, because she was female, because her family did not have wealth. Each assumption cut like a blade, but each one also hardened her resolve. Her grandmother wrote letters from Casablanca, long flowing notes full of advice, encouragement, and reminders of dignity. "Remember, Danielle," one letter had said, "to carry yourself as if your soul wears a crown, even if your hands carry plates." Those words stayed with her when she began working in restaurants to help pay for community college. They stayed when she endured long shifts, sore feet, and the endless tide of customers who barely looked at her face when placing orders. But her grandmother's lessons had done more than teach her endurance. They had given her armor. She learned to hold her ground, to absorb insults without losing her center, to respond with grace where others expected collapse, and quietly she still carried the gift of Arabic, tucked away in her chest, rarely revealed but never forgotten. By the time Danielle found herself at La Maison d'Or, she was not just a waitress balancing trays. She was a woman who had lived in two worlds, who had seen wealth and poverty, kindness and cruelty, and learned that true strength was not about shouting louder but about standing taller. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that diners felt, even if they couldn't name it. Some respected it, others ignored it. But all of it was rooted in the foundation her grandmother had laid in Casablanca's sunlit courtyards. And that was why, when Farid al-Mansouri muttered his insults, believing Arabic was a private fortress only he could command, Danielle did not crumble. She recognized every syllable, every inflection, every poisoned word. She heard not just his mockery, but the echo of every arrogant voice that had once told her she was less. And beneath that insult, she heard her grandmother's steady reminder, "Respect is your inheritance. Do not let anyone take it." The diners at La Maison d'Or that Thursday saw only the surface, a waitress with an apron delivering water and bread. They did not see the years behind her. The child in Casablanca watching her grandmother knead dough, the teenager in Atlanta working double shifts, the young woman who balanced responsibility and ambition with unwavering resolve. But all of that lived inside her. It was the foundation upon which she now stood. So when she looked Farid in the eye and spoke back in Arabic, it was not a simple act of translation. It was a revelation of her history, her dignity, her lineage. It was the culmination of years of silence finally broken. The billionaire saw only a waitress daring to speak his language. Danielle knew the truth. It was her language too, and in that moment, it gave her power greater than his money, his watch, his tailored suit. The restaurant would never forget the moment she revealed her fluency. But what truly gave weight to her words was the story behind them. Danielle was not just standing up for herself in that glittering dining room. She was standing up for every lesson her grandmother had instilled, for every quiet dignity her mother had fought to preserve, for every moment she had been underestimated. And the power of that history was something no billionaire could silence. The cracks in the armor, the silence that followed Danielle's words lingered like smoke, curling into every corner of the restaurant. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain from a table in the back. The chandeliers seemed brighter, the polished silver sharper, as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment to break the spell. And at the center of it sat Farid al-Mansouri, a man who had built his life and reputation on never being challenged, now staring into the steady eyes of a woman he had dismissed as invisible only minutes before. Farid's first instinct was to laugh, though the sound that escaped his throat was brittle, hollow, a poor imitation of the confidence he had worn so easily before. He reached for his glass of water, his fingers tapping the rim to disguise the slight tremor in his hand. His phone lay forgotten beside him, its screen dimming as though it too no longer mattered. The smirk that had once been so casual now felt forced, drawn too tightly across his face. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, searching for a line that would restore the balance, that would place the spotlight back in his control. But every word he conjured seemed to wither before it reached his lips. Across from him, his young associate sat frozen, eyes wide, the faintest flush creeping up his neck. He had always seen his employer as untouchable, a man whose words carried the weight of wealth and whose confidence silenced dissent. Yet now, watching Farid's composure falter under the gaze of a single waitress, he felt something unexpected. Shame. Shame not only for the words spoken but for his own silence, his failure to step in earlier. his willingness to let arrogance pass unchallenged. He glanced at Danielle, then back at Farid, and for the first time, he wondered if loyalty to wealth was worth the cost of dignity. The nearby diners, though still unsure of the exact words exchanged, leaned subtly toward the table, their curiosity sharpening like knives. They had felt the tension build, heard the sharp tone of Farid's voice, and now, though they did not understand Arabic, they understood power. It was shifting, palpably, visibly. Forks paused midair, wineglasses hovered untouched. Even the piano player in the corner faltered for half a beat before recovering, his fingers striking softer, hesitant notes. Danielle did not press forward with anger, nor did she retreat into silence. She stood tall, her notepad resting against her apron, her eyes calm and unblinking. Her voice had already spoken enough. Now her presence spoke the rest. She did not need to prove herself further. She had revealed the truth, and the truth hung heavy in the air. That calmness, that refusal to be shaken, unsettled Farid more than any outburst could have. Men like him were used to confrontation, to yelling, to threats. They were not prepared for composure, for quiet dignity that could not be bought or intimidated. Perhaps, Farid began finally, his English thick with his accent, his words slower now, more deliberate. We should not misunderstand each other. His voice lacked the cutting edge it had carried before. He leaned back in his chair, attempting to settle into his familiar aura of superiority, but the illusion had cracked. The slight tremble in his hand, the way his eyes darted briefly around the room as if measuring how many people were watching, betrayed him. Danielle inclined her head, her expression unchanged. She did not need to argue, for the battle was no longer hers to fight. The restaurant itself had become the witness, and Farid's struggle to reclaim control was visible to everyone. She turned gracefully, moving toward another table, her posture unshaken, her steps measured. The moment belonged to her, and she did not need to cling to it. Her strength lay in letting it stand on its own. As she walked away, whispers began to rise. A couple near the window exchanged knowing looks, murmuring under their breath. A group of businessmen at the far end of the room leaned toward each other, their conversation clearly shifting to the spectacle they had just witnessed. Even the staff at the bar, usually so disciplined in their discretion, allowed themselves a quick glance at one another, eyebrows raised in silent acknowledgement. Something extraordinary had just happened, and everyone knew it. Back at the table, Farid's mask of composure continued to slip. He lifted his phone, pretending to scroll through messages, though his eyes barely registered the words. His associate cleared his throat softly, the sound awkward, hesitant, like a man standing at the edge of a decision. He wanted to say something, to apologize to Danielle on behalf of both of them, perhaps, or to quietly distance himself from the arrogance that had tainted the air. But fear still held him back. Years of conditioning, of learning that contradicting power came with consequences, kept him frozen. Farid tried again, his voice pitched lower now, directed at his associate. She is clever, yes? But do not mistake this for more than it is. He spoke in English, knowing the room was listening, trying to reframe the narrative, but his words fell flat, carrying none of the authority they once held. His associate only nodded faintly, eyes fixed on his plate, unwilling to meet his gaze. In the kitchen, Danielle leaned briefly against the counter, her hand resting on the cool stainless steel. She was not trembling, nor was her heart racing. Years of endurance had prepared her for moments like this. She exhaled slowly, centering herself, hearing her grandmother's voice echo in her memory. Strength is not in the shout, my child, but in the silence that follows it. And she knew that whatever happened next, she had already shifted something fundamental. The billionaire might still have his wealth, his power, his connections, but in this room, in this moment, his armor had cracked. The evening was not over. Meals still had to be served, orders fulfilled, tables cleared. But as Danielle re-entered the dining floor, the balance of the restaurant had changed. She no longer blended into the background. Every eye that glanced her way saw more than a waitress. They saw the woman who had stood tall, who had revealed fluency not just of language but of strength. And though she carried herself with the same professional grace, her presence now carried a gravity that even Farid could not ignore. At his table, he straightened his suit jacket, lifted his glass, and forced a sip of water, the condensation slick against his fingers. His jaw tightened, his expression drawn taut. But his eyes, when they flickered toward Danielle once more, held something they had not before. Unease. And for a man like him, unease was the first step toward defeat. The cracks in the armor had begun to show. And once armor cracked, it never truly held again. The clash, the hum of conversation at La Maison d'Or had not quite returned to normal. It had shifted, softened, and now carried an undercurrent of awareness. Every diner in the room knew they were in the presence of something unusual, something unscripted. And though most pretended to return to their meals, their eyes betrayed them. They lingered on Danielle as she moved between tables, noting her composure, the fluid way she carried herself, her ability to maintain professionalism, even after standing up to a man who had seemed untouchable only moments before. The quiet dignity she exuded was magnetic, while the man in the navy suit by the window, once a figure of command, now looked smaller, weighed down by the invisible eyes of the crowd. Ferd felt the shift as keenly as if it were a physical wound. For years, his life had been a parade of control. He was the man with the resources, the authority, the presence that bent rooms toward him, but now the weight of his wealth meant nothing against the steel of a waitress's gaze. He sat rigid, trying to gather the tatters of his composure, his hand gripping the stem of his glass with more force than necessary. The water he sipped did nothing to cool the heat rising in his chest. Every second Danielle carried herself with calm detachment was a reminder that he had been stripped of the one thing he prized most: power. Desperation made arrogance bloom louder. He leaned toward his associate, lowering his voice, but not enough to escape the notice of the tables nearby. "Do you see this? A waitress with illusions of grandeur. Do not mistake her words for significance." His English was firm, but the cracks in his tone betrayed his unraveling confidence. His associate gave no answer, only stared at his plate as though the salmon resting there was far more compelling than the scene unfolding. The silence from across the table was damning. It told Ferd what no one else dared to say aloud. His shield of dominance was breaking. Danielle approached again, her posture as straight as ever, her face calm, her notepad balanced in her hand, though she had no need to use it. She paused at his table, offering the same steady courtesy she had shown since the beginning. "Is everything to your satisfaction, sir?" Her tone was neutral, her words professional, yet there was an unspoken strength beneath them. It was not defiance, not aggression, but something far sharper: composure. The question should have been easy. A nod, a muttered yes, and the moment could have passed. But Ferd could not let it pass. To do so would be to concede, to admit that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. He straightened his shoulders, forced a tight smile, and said, "Satisfaction is earned by excellence. We will see if this restaurant can provide it." His voice carried farther than necessary, pitched not only to her but to the room beyond, an attempt to remind the audience of his authority. Yet instead of admiration, a ripple of unease followed his words. Diners glanced at each other, some shaking their heads, others tightening their lips. The performance rang hollow. Danielle did not falter. She inclined her head with quiet grace. "Of course, sir. Excellence is what we strive for." She turned smoothly, stepping away without another word. Her refusal to be baited was its own form of victory, and Ferd knew it. He clenched his jaw, his fingers drumming against the linen tablecloth. She had denied him the battle on his terms, and in doing so she had won ground he could not reclaim. The associate shifted again, his discomfort now palpable. He leaned closer to Ferd, whispering, "Perhaps we should let it go. Everyone is watching." His voice was low, almost pleading, but Ferd bristled. The thought of yielding to a waitress, of lowering himself in front of an audience he was used to commanding, was unbearable. His pride roared louder than reason, and pride had been the downfall of many men before him. When Danielle returned with their entrees, the room's attention followed her like a tide. She set the dishes down with the same steady hands, her movements precise, professional. The lamb placed before Ferd, the salmon before his associate, each dish garnished and arranged with the elegance La Maison d'Or was known for. She stepped back, offering her usual courteous nod. "Please enjoy your meals." Ferd stared down at the plate, then back up at her, his lips tightening into a sneer. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into Arabic again, though louder this time so his associate and anyone nearby could hear. "Let us see if she can serve without the attitude that poisons her steps." The words were laced with venom, deliberate, meant to wound. And yet, Danielle's expression did not change. She met his gaze, her eyes unblinking, and replied in Arabic just as calmly, her voice carrying enough strength for him alone to hear. Attitude, sir, is often the word used when confidence frightens those unaccustomed to it. His face hardened instantly, his lips parting as though to fire back, but the words stalled. The associate's fork froze halfway to his mouth. At a table nearby, a woman tilted her head, sensing the electricity in the air, though she could not decipher the language. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, heavy with the weight of every listener leaning closer, every set of eyes now firmly turned toward them. Ferd sat back sharply, his chair scraping against the polished floor. The sound drew even more attention, diners glancing openly now, no longer pretending to mind their own business. His attempt to regain control had only tightened the noose of public scrutiny. For a man who thrived on appearances, the humiliation was unbearable. He reached for his fork, cutting into the lamb with jerky, unnecessary force as though the meat itself had wronged him. The slice was uneven, messy, a small betrayal of the control he tried so hard to project. Danielle, meanwhile, had already turned away, her composure unshaken, her steps measured as she attended to another table. She did not need to linger at his side. The battle was no longer confined to words. It was written in posture, in tone, in the way the room itself had shifted its loyalty. She had not raised her voice, had not insulted him in return. She had simply revealed the truth, and the truth had stripped him bare. The clash had been inevitable. Pride against dignity, arrogance against composure. But in the end, the outcome was already written. One man's voice grew louder, sharper, desperate to hold on to power, while one woman's quiet strength spoke volumes without ever breaking. And as the meals cooled under the weight of silence, everyone in La Maison d'Or knew it. The billionaire's voice no longer carried command. It carried only the sound of a man trying and failing to mend the cracks in his own armor.